Okay, cool. So again, I'm Lauren. I'm going to be kind of co-hosting, but tonight our speaker of the hour is Maria Rose Belding. So Maria Rose started founding a means database when she was only 14 years old. And then it went live when she was 18 years old. So she's going to talk about her journey as being like a young nonprofit leader, as well as talking about food insecurity and resources regarding that through her nonprofit means database. So Maria Rose Belding is super accomplished and amazing person overall. So among numerous recognitions, in 2018, she became the youngest woman featured as CNN Hero of the Year. So without further ado, I'll let Maria Rose take it away from here.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to talk to you. You'd think, having started and run a nonprofit tech company for a while, I would really have zoomed down all the way. I maybe don't, so we're going to find out together. So I'm going to share my slides. There we go. And then we're gonna okay, can everybody see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, awesome. I'm going to cover a lot of topics here. I know we have a number of social work students here, so some of what I'm talking about is fairly specific to social work. Some of it is more specific to nonprofit tech and social innovation. Some of it is food insecurity, food waste in general. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I think, frankly, it's a lot more interesting when I get to hear questions from you guys and we can have an actual discussion. So feel free to leave questions in the side chat, and I will be more than happy to answer them after we get through this. So, like Lauren so graciously introduced me, my name is Maria Rose. I use she, her pronouns. I started Means as an 8th grader in rural Iowa, ran it until I was 26, left to start my medical graduate program at Georgetown. So I'm actually sitting here at Georgetown. This whiteboard had a bunch of chemistry on it about 20 minutes ago. So I'm a fellow graduate student and I understand the demands on your time because same. So I really appreciate you being here and let's go ahead and get started. All right, so this is one story of many of what Means does, but I always like to start with one like this because I think it's quite emblematic of the work that we do. Coca-Cola had this incredible surplus. They had 40,000 pounds of Powerade that was near date. It was so close to near date that they didn't feel like they were going to be able to sell it and have a retailer buy it, but it was not past date. And there was enough lead time that if somebody could consume it in the next month, it was good to go. It would be safe to eat. So they posted this 40,000 pounds on our platform. In less than an hour, a really great organization called LA on Cloud 9 claimed it. And within 24 hours of that time, they were on the street distributing it. So here are some very cool photos from that distribution. Went to pretty exclusively unhoused folks and their pets, which is very, very cool. And we were especially happy that something like Powerade went to these folks because this is July in LA. So it's very, very warm. And a lot of these individuals are living in tents, maybe at best living in a car. So they're very hot, very sweaty all the time. So being able to distribute things that had a ton of electrolytes and are also easy for people who may not have great dentition that might struggle with harder foods was awesome. So this is a kind of a brief encapsulation of what we do. We take food that a restaurant, a manufacturer, somebody who makes food professionally, when they have excess, our platform connects them to a nonprofit that needs it. And I will go into this in more detail in a little bit. But for now, oh boy, doesn't seem to want me to move on. Oh, all right, there we go. So since 2014, 2014, we have been responsible for recovering more than 9 million pounds of food and rerouting it to nonprofits like LA on Cloud 9. In addition, we've purchased more than 600,000 meals directly from majority BIPOC owned small businesses. That was a program we did with Grubhub during COVID, still doing that a little bit. And 90% of the money they gave us went directly to these restaurants. So at this point, it's almost $5 million that we've been able to invest in these small businesses. And it was great because we got to purchase meals specifically for the charities and the folks that they serve. So it was really great because we got to help out multiple groups of people at the same time. So every one of these little red dots, I know that's it's not zoomed in enough, I know to really see it, but every single one of those red dots is in LA on Cloud 9. Every single one of those red dots is a charity, a house of worship, a nonprofit, a soup kitchen, a shelter, somebody feeding people for free, somebody providing food, meals, sustenance, basic supplies of living at no charge to people who are not in a position to afford it. We're going to chat very briefly about the difference between famine and food insecurity. If anybody has a more global health background or global impact background, that's more where famine is. Famine is we've had widespread agricultural failure, whether that be from armed conflict and farmers couldn't safely stay with their fields and collect their harvests. That can be a climate change induced natural disaster. That can be a situation like Somalia has been in and out of for almost a decade, in which the government is withholding food from the people as a means of control. That's famine. That is truly, we don't have enough supply for whatever reason. There just literally is not enough food for the number of people that need it. Food insecurity is more what we're dealing with stateside. And food insecurity is really a priorities problem. We have the food, like we made it and we bought it and we shipped it and we put all this energy and money and time into all this food and we're still throwing a third of it away. Food insecurity is frankly a lot more solvable than famine, or at least more addressable, because we could deal with probably 90% of American food insecurity if we just kind of cared enough. If we had enough of a priority legislatively, if we had enough of a priority about people who are food insecure, we could solve a lot of this. The pieces are already there. So food insecurity is, in the US at least, we're using USDA definitions here. Mild food insecurity is, okay, I might miss a couple of meals a month, or I'm really not sure where I'm going to get meals, maybe at the end of the month when my food stamps have run out, or maybe I'm technically able to eat most meals, but I'm eating food that isn't as healthy, or it's not the food I would choose to eat. It's just what I can afford. So I'm purchasing things just to get enough calories instead of maybe what nutritionally is what I want or what is culturally appropriate. It's truly just, okay, this is what I can afford, even though it's Doritos. As we move from this green to the red, that's where we go to the, you are missing half a week's worth of meals a month or more, or you are truly, unfortunately, we see severe food insecurity or very low food security, as the USDA calls it, in kids most often. And we tend to see it Monday mornings because they got lunch at school on Friday. And then they come back to school Monday morning and they eat breakfast at school and then they throw it up because they haven't eaten that weekend, or they've eaten very, very little. That is what the more severe food insecurity looks like. Oh, cool. Animation I forgot I had. All right. So let's talk about who goes hungry in our country while I drink some water for a second. Sorry. All right. Who goes hungry in America? About 1 in 8 of us. About 1 in 8 Americans is somewhere along that food insecurity gradient of somebody, you're in there somewhere. About 1 in 8 of us. It does kind of depend on who you ask. There are some statistics that say more like 1 in 7. There are some statistics that say more like 1 in 12. There's also some issues of, okay, they're food secure, but it's because they're going to a food pantry every month. So they would be food insecure if they weren't accessing these tools like food stamps and private assistance. So this is ish, 1 in 8 ish. But the thing is, that's still an unbelievable amount of people. That's still an absolutely unbelievable amount of people in this country. And it can be anyone. We're going to talk about the demographics here in a second, but if I get nothing into you today than this, let it be that there is no face of hunger. There's no one situation. There's no one demographic. There's no, it can be anybody. So just kind of keep that in mind. But like truly every other social disadvantage and social crisis, there are groups who are more vulnerable. For hunger and food insecurity, it's Indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities in this country. It's kids, especially kids that have a single parent or no income household, college students, especially community college, people with physical disabilities, especially if physical disability keeps them from being able to work, and maybe they're not eligible for SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, elderly on fixed income, LGBTQ folks like me, and people who have substance use disorders, alcohol use disorder, that generally you see among unhoused people more than anything. But these are folks who are at higher risk, just statistically speaking. This is the USDA kind of graph. This is their like go-to graph. They've used this truly every year. They update it. They don't even change the font or the colors. Just this same graph you can find from the USDA going back like 30 years. But this is one of the more recent ones. And this is saying, okay, so somewhere between like 11%-ish of households in this country are food insecure, anywhere along the gradient. And then about 5% are very low food security. And that's the most severe, seeing acute medical crises because they haven't eaten in, a week. That's more where they're at. This is a breakdown from that same USDA data. So using the same information that the USDA used here, this graph was created by, I believe, Feeding America. So as you can see, like every other social injustice in this country, things are not applied equally here. There are more hungry white people in this country than anyone else, just numbers wise, population wise, but percentage wise, this is an issue that is much more concentrated in communities of color. So you can see, and you can kind of see in here the recession of 08-09, where we had kind of the first really big spike in American food insecurity in about 30 years. You can see how much more that impacted Black and Hispanic communities, more so that it was bad for everybody. Around the 08-09, you can see that it went up for everybody, but it was even more pronounced for those folks. And this is just going to be me being a nerd for a second about data. This graph and I are going to have a fight. So this is part of why it's so important to, when you're looking at data and then you're looking at individual people, this is part of why it is so, so important to look at where the data came from. So for whatever reason, the folks who did this study kind of decided that other was just anybody else. So that's anybody who's not Black, Hispanic, or white, you're in this other. And that really hides a lot of information. I just put 3 of the many groups here that are not counted, and they're all squished together into that light blue line. And that's a problem. Asian Americans have the lowest food insecurity rate. They are the most food secure of any racial or ethnic group in the United States. But even in that group, there's a huge disparity between recent arrivals in the United States, between refugees and immigrants, and families that have been here a little bit longer. Even there's a huge disparity. But because this other category shoves Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous and Alaska Natives, everybody else together, we don't see these patterns. But actually, so Indigenous Alaska Natives, so people who are identify as Indigenous Americans, whether on the mainland or in Alaska, they have the highest food insecurity rate of anybody. It's between 20 and 25%, and that is the highest of any group in this country. But because they are so often relegated to other, we can't necessarily see that. It's the same thing with Pacific Islanders. You guys are probably familiar with the acronym AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. Often those two are grouped together, and sometimes that's okay demographically, and sometimes that hides really substantial disparities like this, because Pacific Islanders are more food insecure than Black communities and Hispanic communities and everybody else. So this is part of why, and again, this is me being a nerd about data, but this is part of why it's so important to look at stuff like this and understand who's not being counted. And if they're not being counted, why not? And maybe what the implications are around that for policy. Because if you make decisions based on other having a lower food security rate, lower, like if you just make decisions based on, well, everybody else is under the average, so we don't need to worry about food insecurity in any of these other groups because it's under the average. Yeah, we do. We got to worry about it. We got to worry about it a lot. So that's just me going off about that for a second. But this is a map of across the country. While there is enormous racial diversity in who is food insecure, there's also really significant geographic disparity. So there really is no place in the country where nobody's food insecure. There's really like no county in America where absolutely zero people are going hungry. But it varies a lot by geography. So as you can see on our map here, the darker the green, the higher the food insecurity rate. And this is everybody. This is kids, grown-ups, seniors, college kids, everybody together. This is a deeply depressing graph I'm about to transition to. So this is the same graph, but it's just kids. Yeah, so you can see it got a lot darker. It got a lot darker. And unfortunately, kids are the most vulnerable of anybody, just statistically speaking, to food insecurity. And you can see just how concentrated food insecurity is amongst children. And not only is that just viscerally upsetting from a moral standpoint, it also is really, really not great for those kids long term. I also, because y'all are at Rutgers, I pulled up the same data for y'all. So this is overall, we're back to overall here, not just kids, but by county around y'all, this is about what food insecurity looks like for you in your region. And when we're doing Q&A, I'm happy to bring it back to this if that would be helpful. This is DC. This is just where I live. You can also really see, so DC has the very wealthy, has like our wealthy white people little neighborhoods, and we actually have the highest individual for like a neighborhood food insecurity in the country for a while was DC's Ward 7 and 8. So you can see even just within the same really small community like DC, how much variation there is. So even sometimes just looking at the county level, you're not always seeing like just how disparate need might be. All right, so talking about root causes, why does this happen? A lot of stuff. There's usually not one, if you're looking at any one individual person or family, and you're trying to see like, okay, why are you food insecure? Why are you not being able to access enough food? It could be one of any of these, and it's probably a couple of them. There's all sorts of reasons people are food insecure, and that's part of why it's not an easy problem to solve. because you've got so many different things that play into why any one individual is hungry. There's usually not an easy answer for any one individual. And that also means for actually solving food insecurity, instead of just treating it successfully with food recovery, actually solving it and preventing it from happening, that's part of why it's so hard, is because you have all of these different pieces at play. So like, just for one, we want to fully solve hunger, we have to solve domestic violence, like the entire concept of domestic violence, which is not a thing that I think we'll ever fully do, to be realistic. So this is just some of the reasons. There are many more, but that's part of why hunger is a really hard problem to solve, because there's just so many reasons why different people might be food insecure. All right, so consequences long term. In the immediate, right away, less showing up to work, less showing up to school, which then also can decrease academic performance, but then it also can decrease the money that you're bringing in, especially if you are an hourly worker. So it's a problem that perpetuates itself. There's an immediate increase in mental health symptoms. So if you already have depression or you already have anxiety, it's going to get worse because you're not eating. There's also an increased risk of new onset acute illness, or if you've got an existing chronic health problem, so you're already a type 2 diabetic, the odds that you're then gonna have a crisis, like you're gonna have a seizure because your blood sugar is so low, that's more likely to happen in the immediate food insecure period. Long term, and this is for kids, and I have all the data and all the sources on this. It's hidden in the comments that you guys can't see. So if you would like my sources, let me know. I'm happy to send them to you. Long term for kids, the consequences of hunger are pretty intense. And like food security is on a gradient, so are these consequences. But overall, far less likely to graduate from high school, far more likely to then have kids themselves that are hungry. Hunger is very intergenerational. It's not exclusively intergenerational, but it is very intergenerational. Also, much earlier parenthood, much less familial stability in terms of living with the same people over a long period of time, or having children with the same partner over a long period of time. A lot more mental health issues, developing them and the severity. There's some really interesting and tragic data on how many kids who grew up hungry, even if they're not hungry as adults, they reach food security as adults, have issues with binge eating. There's a lot of really it's really depressing, but it's also interesting data on these kids now as adults, even who have access to food and they are all good, have trouble learning to eat a normal amount because their whole childhood was, well, I'm going to eat while I can because I don't know that this is going to be here tomorrow. That too plays a big role in more physical chronic health problems, more likely to be obese, more likely to have type 2 diabetes, more likely to have hypertension, more likely to have metabolic syndrome. And that includes, the effect isn't as pronounced, but that includes people who are food secure as adults. Their childhoods follow them into adulthood. And in the most extreme cases, there's some pretty substantive cognitive impairment in these kids, especially if they are age 0 to 5. The younger these kids are when they're very food insecure, the worse the outcomes. But I think a lot of Americans like to think that we don't have people in this country who are substantially limited intellectually and occupationally because they starved as kids. I think a lot of Americans think that that's not a thing here, that's only a third world country issue. It is not. It is fairly rare at this point, but it is not non-existent. So the consequences for these kids when we don't get them the food that they need can be really, really dire and lifelong. So even if you are, not emotionally moved or disturbed by food insecurity with kids, there's a pretty substantial just legislative and medical and economic argument for why it's so important to feed these kids. So what can help? what's out there that'll help. Ooh, I went too fast. All right. So everybody here, or most people here are social workers or in social work school. So I'm gonna blow through this super fast, but SNAP, WIC, TANF, National School Lunch Program, and its weird little cousin summer food service program that we're going to talk about in a second. Medicaid, earned income tax credit, Section 8, subsidized childcare, those last few things, even if it's not a program that directly gives you money for food or directly gives you food, they still benefit household food security, because then these families that part of their budget was going toward rent or part of their budget was going toward childcare, you've now freed that up for food. So even investments that aren't directly in food security still end up improving the food security status of these households, because magically they've got money that's opened up and then they're able to use it on food privately. So this is not sponsored by the government or not assistance coming from the government, but it is absolutely essential. It is 100% essential to the survival of these families and these kids and these adults and these everybody. Food pantries, soup kitchens, meal programs, shelters, mutual aid, usually not food banks. I'm going to explain that here in a second. The industry term for all of these is emergency food provider, or EFP. And I'm going to use that acronym a lot. And if you need me to review it, let me know. But here's the TLDR of that, of what an EFP is. That's anybody, whether they're legally a nonprofit, whether they're legally a corporation, whether it's just a bunch of people showing up to help. That is an organization directly providing groceries, meals, elements of survival, something to people who need it without charging them. That's the key part there, is that they are not required, the folks that these people serve, these organizations serve, they are not required to pay for it. It's not subsidized, it is free. That's what makes an EFP. So, food pantries. Depending on where you're at in the country, these can be called food shelves, food kitchens. Occasionally, they're called food closets. This photo up above is the food pantry that I grew up volunteering in at Peace Lutheran Church in Pella, Iowa. It's literally a closet. And then we knocked out at one point part of the wall behind it to make it bigger. But these are often literal closets. They're often pretty small, and they're usually kind of retrofitted into an existing community space. So you can find food pantries in churches, in mosques, in temples, in community centers. Sometimes schools have them, sometimes hospitals have them. For the most part, these are pretty small operations, and they're usually being run by a volunteer, or maybe they have 1 or 2 paid employees, if that. These are usually pretty small, and they are the lifeblood of these communities, and they are so important. A food bank is slightly different. So food bank is basically a Costco for charities. Food banks are these massive warehouses, and they will buy food in bulk and receive food donations in bulk that they will then sell to food pantries. So food pantries have to buy food from food banks. It's usually only 10 or 12 cents a pound. It can be up to 25 cents a pound, but usually it's less than retail, but they do have to pay for it. So your local Feeding America food bank, they are selling food to these nonprofits. It is not free. And there's annual dues, there's fees, there's different delivery fees, and it's not free. And that's just another thing I want to hammer home. It's not free for these nonprofits directly feeding people. And also, food banks don't directly serve individuals. So you're a social worker, you have a client that needs food. If you send them to the local food bank, that food bank is not going to help them, and also is not going to be able to help them. Food banks are a really important part of the whole emergency food network. They're a really important part of making sure that food pantries are stocked. We couldn't exist without them, but they don't directly serve people, and you do have to pay for them. Meal programs. So these are just some of the meal programs that we work with. There's a lot of different places that do meal programs. Traditional homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, transitional housing, street missions, so folks who are literally on the street distributing meals, mutual aid, lots of different places that do meal programs. And then summer food service program, which is kind of this fun little cousin of National School Lunch Program. National School Lunch Program is free and reduced lunch and breakfast at school. SFSP is sponsored by the federal government. It is technically a federal program, but nobody has to participate. There's nothing, unlike National School Lunch Program, there's nothing that says, hey, school, or hey, community center, you have to feed these same kids for the summer. There is nothing that says that. Individual charities and community centers and schools have to apply to be part of this. And this is just for examples, but these meal sites can kind of be anywhere. They're public park up in Maine, hospitals will do it literally in a classroom during the summer. Sometimes it's at a community center, kind of all over the place. So this is just some of our user growth. This is actually kind of old. I need to update this slide. My apologies. Zoomed out, this is all of our nonprofit partners. Zoomed in slightly more, there's more. And then there's your area or kind of close. So every single one of those red dots is an emergency food provider. So soup kitchen, homeless shelter, food pantry, tiny little closet in a little church basement. That's one of those red dots. What we do. So this is our website. This is the Means website. It's just meansdatabase.org or foodrecovery.org. 14-year-old me liked acronyms. 27-year-old me continues to have regrets. I wish I had chosen a name that kind of conveyed what we do more succinctly, but it's an acronym: matching excess and need for stability. We do two things. We do food recovery and the community meal program. I'm going to be focused on food recovery here. We recover what would otherwise go to waste. And I'm going to grab, so I'm a type 1 diabetic and my blood sugar is a little low, so I'm going to eat some fruit snacks while I lecture. One moment, my apologies. All right, so talk about food waste. Food waste is not this. As soon as food has been put in somebody's hands, as soon as somebody's eaten it, as soon as it's out on a buffet line that somebody could have breathed on, we don't touch that, and neither will anybody else. Food waste is something like what's in green back there. Food waste is, it got made, it got prepared, it's safe to consume, but for whatever reason, nobody ate it. That's fair game for us to touch. And in general, there's actually legally, there's pretty immense coverage for even if you are trying to recover something like what's in the red. I am not aware of a single organization that does that. Just because of the food safety concern, like just because the law may allow you to recover things that have been distributed to people, we won't take it. We won't touch it because we hold ourselves to a higher standard than what the law does. So 30 to 40% of the food in this country is thrown away. And of that, most of it is food that we can recover. That's food that we can touch. That's food that is safe to consume. So we can save a lot of food. There's a lot of food that we can save, and there's a lot of food that we can get to people who need it without ever touching anything where there's any sort of food safety concern. Again, sorry, I got to eat on camera. One moment. All right, apologies. So if food loss and food waste was its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So I really came to this work from the food justice side. There are people who are hungry and we can feed them, and we're just choosing not to. That's where I came to this work, and most of our team came to this work. But there are also folks on our team and plenty of other people in this space who are here because of the really extraordinary environmental consequences of food waste. And there's a lot of arguments here for why it's important that we reduce food waste and that we feed people. This is one of many, that food waste is actively killing our planet. All right, so these are just some pictures of the Mean staff that have made all of this possible. We were tiny little children when we started. We are slightly older. I just turned 27. Most of the team, actually almost everybody on the team now, is younger than me. We hired our wonderful new CEO, Sammy. She is in, let's see, she's in basically all of these pictures. If you look at the one on the bottom left, where everybody's got the hack to end hunger, she is furthest to the right. She's awesome. She took over for me as CEO. I'm now chair of the board, so I could go to this grad program at Georgetown. Being chair of the board, it's kind of like, and being the executive director, it's like going from being the bowling ball to being kind of the bumpers. So instead of being in charge every day of everything, like I was as executive director, now as board chair, I'm kind of just here to make sure that, you know, we don't completely hop off our lane and destroy a wall or something. I'm really just there to stick my head in and be like, nothing's on fire. Everything's good. Y'all need anything? Y'all good? Okay, cool. So I still am involved with big picture strategy decisions. I'm still involved with budgeting and some grant writing, but for the most part, I am really here to make sure nobody lights anything on fire and or they're not on fire themselves. So I'm very proud of the work that I've done for Means. I'm very proud of how much work of mine went into where we are, but none of it would happen without everybody on this page and a lot of other people I didn't have room for with pictures. I have had the pleasure to steer the ship for a long time, but this does not happen without every single other person at Means working their butts off to make this happen. And I always want to make sure that that's very conveyed, that I have the title of co-founder and original executive director and CEO, but this would not happen without every single other person working so hard to pull this off. We succeed and we fail together. Every big win that Means has had, it's because everybody was working toward the same goal. And every time we failed, we all failed together as one unit. All right, so these are just some of the organizations and companies that we work with. On the left, you have just some of the brands that and restaurants and companies that we recover food from. So these are folks who are on the Means platform and donate food when they have excess. That includes the actual state of Rhode Island and some other municipalities, which has been pretty cool over the last couple of years. And the other side, you have our recipients. Biggest thing here is that Means is free to use. You do not have to pay us. It costs the nonprofits absolutely nothing to be on our platform, to claim food, to receive donations, absolutely nothing. They do not have to pay us. Even if we felt comfortable charging them, which I'm not morally, they don't have money. That's kind of the whole thing. We want to make sure that they have access to basic technology that everybody in for-profit industry had for 20 years by the time we open Means nationwide. Really, we exist to even the playing field here a little bit and give these nonprofits the ability to access food that's available in their community and not have to waste time making a bunch of phone calls back and forth and hoping another nonprofit didn't beat them to it. Like a big piece of Means' origin story is me volunteering in my hometown pantry and seeing that we were still using fax machines to talk to the farmers in our community and the local grocery stores. And with all the tact of an 8th grader, I went to our food pantry director and was like, why? Like, why are we not using the internet? Like, this is so dumb. Why are we not using the internet? Definitely could have phrased that better as a child. But the reason we weren't using the internet is because nobody built a way for us to do it. There was no free, accessible way for everybody to be on the same page. And that's really what means is, at the end of the day, matching excess and need for stability. We exist to get everybody on the same page in a way that is respectful of everybody's time and also doesn't assume to know what the charities want. The few other models that existed before Means showed up would assign food automatically. It would just say, well, here's the nearest charity, go drop it off. That doesn't work. Not every nonprofit can take 40,000 pounds of Powerade. You can't just leave it on their doorstep. We did have that happen, actually. Some pizza parlor in rural New Hampshire had a whole pallet of pizza sauce that was supposed to show up in jars, and it showed up in like little packets instead. And so they just left it on the doorstep of this itty bitty church, this whole pallet. And this poor little old lady that was their executive director, full volunteer, couldn't even get into the church because these pallets were in the way. So we helped her move it. It got to a state food bank that had a processing facility, and they were able to put it into larger quantities and then distribute it in a way that still maintained food safety. But that's the ethos that Guides means, is these folks know their communities and themselves better than we ever could, and we don't ever want to assume that we do. So a tool like Means allows them to be in the driver's seat and only accept donations that they actually want and can actually use. And then they don't end up even having to pay to throw it away. Dumpsters aren't free. The worst case scenario is a charity gets dumped something they can't use and they have to pay to get rid of it. So super quick social work thing, and then I'm going to open up questions. Here are barriers to emergency food providers for individual clients. So for individual people, they don't have a car, especially in a rural place, or public transit isn't accessible to these little tiny soup kitchens, charities. Because most of these nonprofits are really small, they're not open all the time. They may only be open once or twice a week. And they might only be open, like the food pantry I grew up volunteering in just started being open 3 days a week, like just this year, because they're all run by volunteers and they're doing their best. But if they're only open once a week and you work during that time, or you've got your kids, or you've got something else that you can't move, you just can't go use that resource. So that's a huge issue, is just that these nonprofits are doing their best, but they're not open all that often. Same thing, you've got some issues with language barriers. You often will have clients that are afraid that if they seek food assistance, CPS is going to get involved. They think that having asked for help with food is going to get CPS to think that they're being neglectful of their children, even though asking for help with food is the least neglectful thing they can do, is asking for help and trying to find it. And shame is the big thing. People really, really don't want to acknowledge that they need help. That's a hard thing to acknowledge, and to ask for help that you aren't able to put food on the table right now, especially if you have kids. That's a really tough thing to acknowledge to yourself, let alone to a stranger. Now quadruple that if you're in a small town and you know the people who volunteer at the food pantry. By the time folks show up to get emergency food assistance, they needed it like 3 months ago, usually, or longer. That's part of why it's so important that the language we use around this, it's not you admit that you're not able to put food on the table. You don't admit that you're hungry. You acknowledge it. There is just so much shame. So everything we can do around language is important. And then on the emergency food provider side, again, these are really tiny and they've been retrofitted for the most part into existing buildings. A lot of these places are not ADA accessible. I have a mobility disability. It's called dysautonomia. Basically, I have a hard time with stairs. I can't get in to a bunch of our member food pantries. Like, I physically can't access the space, and anybody in a wheelchair can't either. So that's a huge piece of this, is that, these nonprofits are doing their best, but a lot of times they were not designed thinking about people with physical disabilities, which is extra brutal because people with mobility disabilities are way overrepresented among people who need food pantries in the first place. Some of them, not very often, but sometimes there are nonprofits that require proof of US citizenship to access their pantry. More often, it will be they require documentation of, okay, we need an ID just to know who you are, or we need a piece of mail. This is the one for the pantry I grew up. You need a piece of mail with the zip code of our county, so we know that you're from here. That's pretty common. Not everybody has that, especially if you're not housed. And if you're undocumented and you're really, really afraid of ICE, that can be enough to keep people from going. And there are some absolutely wonderful nonprofits that we work with that specifically serve these communities and really make sure that they know that they're safe. But that's a huge reason people don't seek assistance, is they're afraid they're going to get deported. So whatever we can do for folks to help them know that they're safe, that's super, super important. Other reasons, there will be monthly limits, especially nonprofits that are just drowning. Like for a long time, the pantry I grew up in, you could only visit once or twice a month because just there were too many people who needed help. And that was the attempt to try to balance it. But you might need it more than once a month. You might need the pantry once a week or even more often, and you might not be able to go that often. And the last thing, this isn't super common, but it does happen. You will encounter, I don't understand how you can be someone whose Christian faith has led them to open a pantry, but you also won't serve somebody because you think they're gay. Really don't understand how those two things can coexist, especially as a queer Christian myself, but you will run into it. And you will especially run into it with trans folks and trans folks who maybe don't pass super well. This can be a real barrier because like you don't want to go into a space where people are like, not only have you had to acknowledge that you need help, now they're not going to help you because of who you are as a human being. It's not very often anymore that people will explicitly say that pantries will explicitly say, we don't serve X, Y, and Z people, but you will encounter it, unfortunately. It's not that common, but all it takes is one experience as an LGBT person. All it takes is one experience, and you're never going to ask for help again. Like at one point, we had a nonprofit say they didn't want any more food from us because I let it, because I lead means. Even though the food didn't come from me, I never touched it. I never had anything to do with it. The idea that a queer person, and a lot of our team, 40% of our team is LGBT, the idea that some queer and trans people had something to do with it meant they didn't want it, even if more people weren't going to be fed. So it's not very common, but it does happen, and it's really frustrating. But as somebody going into social work, just know that that's a thing, unfortunately. Quick tips for helping clients, and we're going to open it to questions. Get to know the local nonprofits. Just ask the other social workers. They'll know the nonprofits who are great. They'll know the ones that maybe aren't as great. They'll know their documentation rules. They'll know the actual written rules and the unwritten rules about who they'll serve and why and how often. If somebody is unhoused, or maybe they're housed but their electricity is being shut off frequently, focus on meal sites or non-perishable groceries. Like nothing worse than sending somebody to get help and then maybe using very limited bus pass money to go get food, but then they can't safely store it, so it goes bad and they can't eat it. So keep that in mind. If there are kids, check for blessing in a backpack programs. That's just one name. It's the most commonly used name, but these exist all over the country. Basically, they send kids home with a backpack or a bag of food on Friday and just slip it into the kids' backpack. And it is food that is meant to be okay for kids that maybe mom and dad aren't home or not in a place to be able to help you with food. There's a lot of cheese sticks and individual cups of peanut butter with crackers. And the whole idea is that it is food that a 5-year-old can eat by themselves and be okay. And we don't need to maybe worry about them using a microwave. I already talked about this a lot, but essentially, if you're in a more metropolitan area, you might have more options. If you can, send folks to a food pantry that is run by people who are like them. Whether that's like, there's some really great mosque-based pantries that make sure everything is halal. There are some really great temple-based pantries that make sure everything is kosher. Just keep in mind, where are people going to feel safe walking in? And that even goes for cultural things that aren't specific to a hard rule of this is a rule of the way that we consume food in my faith. Even if it's just, hey, I don't want to send, like this happened in our pantry a couple of times where we had immigrant families and the only thing we could offer them was like pasta. That didn't mean anything to them. That wasn't something they consumed. It didn't have any cultural relevance to them. So when you can, we try to get people to pantries and services that reflect the food that they would eat if they could afford it, that reflects their own culture and history and preferences. So that's what we do. We treat the symptoms of hunger. We keep people alive. And by we, I mean the almost 60,000, both the nonprofits that Means represents and we work with, and the ones that we don't. There's 60,000 emergency food providers or so in this country. There's a lot of them. We keep people alive. We treat the symptoms, but the only thing that's truly going to keep people from needing us is really substantial policy change on SNAP, on WIC, on TANF, on the way that our country policy-wise treats single parents. There's a lot of things that need to change to really prevent hunger from people needing us in the first place. But we are so far from that right now the best thing we can do is feed them as they show up. So with that, I'm going to eat some more fruit snacks while you guys ask questions, and I'm happy to answer.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria Rose. So if anyone has questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or like use the reaction to like put your hand up. And Maria Rose can call on you that way or address whatever question is asked.
I'm just going to ask you, can you just end the presentation mode so we can, yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Sorry, you fully got a view of me eating fruit snacks. My apologies, guys.
No worries. Well, I wrote down a bunch of questions if nobody has any. Does anyone have any questions to ask? Okay. Oh yes, Hannah.
Sorry. One, thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. I guess if you know the answer, one thing I was curious about is how, since food insecurity has a lot of factors that can contribute as to why someone is food insecure, how would we measure if the food insecurity rate is decreasing in a certain area since so many factors cause it?
We can measure actual food insecurity rates the same way we always have, by just literally asking about food security, like asking individuals, do you always have enough money for food at the end of the month? There's some very specific questions that help us determine food security status. So we can see changes in rates of actual food insecurity. It is much more difficult to measure the effect of policy change or specific interventions on food insecurity. We can kind of figure out how much food insecurity there is overall, but it is much more difficult to really assess and get statistical data on what's causing it. And even more difficult is anything working? Is anything we're doing a policy or an individual intervention? Is this helping? Is this making it better? That is much more difficult to tell statistically. I hope that made sense as an answer. Please let me know if I misunderstood your question.
No, it did. It did. I thank you so much. That makes sense.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, I wrote down a bunch. So first of all, thank you very much again for taking the time to meet with us and to discuss your work and also this very alarming issue. I think that, we hear about food insecurity, but we don't learn enough about it. And also all the, you put up that list of issues that all contribute. And so in a way, it also feels a little bit overwhelming, so, but also frustrating because it is something that can be solvable. So again, thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. Actually, Erin just posted a question. We'll get to hers first.
Yeah, the question about proposed policy changes.
Yes.
Great question, first of all. Honestly, right now, like, please stop cutting SNAP. The government increased SNAP benefits at the start of COVID-19. They just cut it, and that's coming to an end. And so we've got a whole lot of families that have been relying on that for several years. And all of a sudden they're going to have $200 less or $300 less a month for food on their SNAP cards. Like, that cliff is going to be difficult. That's really not going to be fun to navigate. It's going to be really difficult. Overall, frankly, the more we can invest in SNAP, in WIC, in TANF, in anything that increases child food security. When we increase child food security, we increase adult food security too. That's the thing. Every investment we make in kids, we really end up benefiting their parents as well. If I had like a magic wand, I would make WIC an entitlement program like SNAP. So what that means is whether like 2 people apply for SNAP across the whole country or 200 million, because it is written as an entitlement program, everybody automatically gets it. There's no such thing as the money running out because it's an entitlement. WIC is not an entitlement. TANF is not an entitlement. So what that means is there's only X little pot of money set aside every year for a certain geographical area for women, infants, and children, for cash assistance for needy families, which is what TANF is. And once that pot of money is gone, it's just gone. It's done. So even if it's August and we're nowhere near the end of the year and there's a wait list twice as long as the number of people actively receiving WIC, doesn't matter, the money's gone. And that's a constant issue. So it would be very, very expensive for us to make WIC and TANF entitlement programs, which is why I don't think it'll ever happen, frankly, because it would be in the billions of dollars. But it would also really, really help, I think, as well, because you would have all of these people who qualify financially, like their income every year, they need it, they would really benefit from it. But because of the way the law is written, they just can't get it because somebody else beat them to turning in the application, essentially.
Anybody else have any more? Okay. So just for the just to be respectful of time, I did, so a few things I wrote down were, well, one of the things you mentioned in the beginning was something about Grubhub. So if Grubhub gave you money to do what? To buy meals and distribute them? Okay.
Yes, so they gave us funding during COVID to purchase meals from, so they had to be small businesses. They had to be, the only 2 rules were that they had to be small businesses as defined by, I think it was 3 or fewer locations. We only did restaurants that had a single location. And then they had to be on the Grubhub platform, but that was it. And we were given this money to pay market rate to these restaurants that have been shuttered to make custom meals for specific nonprofits we were partnered with. So we would go to each of our nonprofit partners and say, okay, magically, you get 200 meals a week. Are they breakfast, lunch, or dinner? What's in them? What kind of cuisine is it? What are you like? magic wand, you get to create this, what is it? And they would tell us, and then we would go find a local restaurant that could meet that need, that also fit the other criteria. So it was really cool because we got to spend a lot of money helping these small businesses. And we prioritized with the restaurants, we prioritized Black and Indigenous owned and folks who didn't get the PPP.
Yeah.
We really prioritized, like, okay, who is the least likely to have gotten the financial support here? So like every week we got to invest pretty significant amounts of money in these restaurants across the country. And we got to deliver hot, freshly prepared, custom made meals to our nonprofits that were getting absolutely slammed. So it was really a rare situation of like, wow, everybody wins. Like I was just so pleasantly surprised, because I was pleasantly surprised by how much we were able to do. And it was just very, very cool to see that much money benefiting multiple pieces, multiple people in the same community over and over and over again for a period of several years.
Yeah. Wow. Is this how you typically get money for is it mostly through like people donating? Do you fill out grants? How do you guys?
So many grants.
Okay.
Yes, anyone on this call who has written a grant before knows the face I just made. Yes, a lot of grant writing. We do get some corporate support, which is fantastic. So individual companies that will fund us. We also have some very wonderful private donors, so individuals who give monthly or yearly and help us make sure that we can pay our own staff and keep doing the work that we do. With programs like Grubhub, it's 90, I believe it's 95 in total. Yeah, 95% of that money ended up in the hands of either the restaurant, which was 90 to 92%, and then 3-ish% for the delivery drivers that were taking the meals from the restaurant to the nonprofits. And that last 5%, that paid for us to do it. That paid for our staff and our team to actually do that program. So that's a pretty common thing in the nonprofit world, to have an admin kind of section of a specific project grant, where it's usually not a big piece of your grant, but it makes sure that your nonprofit isn't losing money trying to do the thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I just think of how long, you were 14 and you built this database. And
I built a really bad version of it at 14. I built like a very bad Google Sites version.
I mean, a lot of tech has to go into this though, right?
Oh, I got very lucky. So my co-founder Grant is also an Iowa native. I flew to DC right after I graduated high school, because I already had an internship here before starting undergrad, and met Grant. He was the older brother of another anti-hunger person I had met, and he saw my very bad version of memes that I written, and he wrote the original core of the website. Like, I know just enough code to look at it and go, oh, that's not good, that's incorrect. But other than that, like Grant created the version of memes that is in use, and we've had a number of really awesome kids and adults that have come through our team over the years to actually make the website function and do what it's supposed to do. But yeah, I can claim credit for the really bad original memes website. But
I was gonna ask you, like, any roadblocks that you've experienced, I guess, on this journey, or like how you found people to get into this database. Was it like word of mouth? How did it like come about?
It came about because I was the youngest person volunteering at my food pantry in Iowa by like probably 30 years. And so that meant I got dumpster duty. I had to go outside and throw food away that had expired into the dumpster. And I literally had to like basketball shoot it because it was taller than me. And I was just so tired of doing that, because there would be people in like the dead of winter, there would be people sitting in their cars waiting to get food from us while I would be throwing food away in front of them.
Yeah. Which
was the most brutal feeling I think I've ever had in my entire life.
Yeah.
And I just got angry. I was just like, why? Like, this is so dumb. Like, we're throwing away so much food. why is this happening? Like, why can't we talk to each other? And the reason we couldn't, because we had a lot of these things, we would try to contact other food pantries in like other counties around us and say like, hey, like this actually happened. Somebody gave us 10,000 pounds of macaroni and cheese without asking us first. Do you want some? But it took so long for everybody to talk to each other that a bunch of it ended up having to be thrown away.
Right.
And I just was really angry that that was happening, and was really upset that I was just really upset that that was still happening. It's like, how are we not using the internet? Like by this point it would have been 2008. Yeah. It's like, how are we not using it? Like, why? I don't know what a fax machine is. Why are we using it? Like, it really came out of those experiences of being so angry and so frustrated and realizing that there was a better way to do this. And
Yeah.
the reason that it didn't exist was just money, because there wasn't profit in it. That's why nobody had built something like this. Is there wasn't a way that you were going to make a ton of money off of it. But it's worthwhile enough to do it, even though it isn't for profit.
Right. Well, that kind of segues into my next and final question.
Mhm.
Although I probably could keep talking to you about this because it's really, I guess, alarming just how pervasive it is.
Mhm.
In terms of when you were talking about, the companies that you pick up food from,
Mhm.
what is the difference, I guess, between a sell-by date and an expiration date? And do you have to follow those? Because I know even with food that's prepared, like a lot of times it has to be at a certain temperature, which is something, that you kind of touched upon in terms of like, if it's already touched by someone, you can't, like, there's a lot of rules around that kind of stuff. So that's also another thing, because you'll see a sell-by date and people will think, oh, I can't consume this anymore, but that's probably different than expiration. And like, how accurate is an expiration date?
The face that I'm making is because
No.
the answer to this is really stupid.
It's
There
probably
isn't.
frustrating. Sorry.
No, there isn't. No, I'm not frustrated with you for asking. I'm frustrated with the system that we have.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's probably a frustrating.
Oh, it's infuriating.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
definition.
Right.
There's no legal definition of what sell by means or expiration means. The only exception to that is baby formula, and for
Okay.
very good reasons. But other than that, it's the manufacturer kind of just guessing,
Yeah.
kind of just going like, all right, sounds good.
Does
So
that impact your work though?
it
And what
does.
people
So
are giving you?
we generally will not take anything that is past date unless we have something from the manufacturer. So this has happened with Kraft a couple of times where
Mhm.
it's been close to within date, and we get information from Kraft that says, all right, here is what our scientists have been able to say. This is it's like a 6-month extension on certain products of like, this is still safe to consume up to X point. But if we can't get information like that and it's past date, we won't touch it.
Yeah.
And part of that's some of that is, concern for liability, but there's really great liability protection. More of it even is just, we just don't want anybody to get hurt.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, there have been no lawsuits over illness from donated food since at least 1996. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of an urban legend that that's a thing,
Yeah.
but it's just not worth the risk, which is frustrating because you're sitting there like, okay, so this date may or may not have any meaning scientifically at all. Like, this could actually be accurate, or this could mean absolutely nothing. But I don't know. And I
Right.
don't think I want to roll the dice on that when I'm giving it to people who are pretty vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The sell by, used by, expires, they're all kind of made up. They're not kind of made up, they're just made up. There's no like real definition of any of them, at least no universal definition. And that's also why when we take prepared foods, you were talking about food safety stuff, prepared foods, that's why we will only work with professional kitchens.
Yeah.
We are not going to take anything that was made in a personal kitchen. We will take from caterers. We will take from restaurants, but if it was not made in a professional kitchen, we're not touching it.
Yeah. That's something that I've kind of come across working with people that have donated. You know, even if something looks like it's closed as well, like at supermarkets or places that might work with, a company that comes and picks up food, like Trader Joe's does that.
Mhm.
But they'll just throw out something that someone didn't open or bought by mistake or something.
Yep.
They don't want to take that risk as well.
Yeah. And
Um,
there's not an easy answer here,
Yeah.
other than, I wish we could go back 50 years and make everybody agree on real definitions. in, like,
Yeah.
1940.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so difficult, and it can feel like you have no good option morally
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
I don't think, given where we're at now, I don't think there is an easy solution.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it contributes to a lot of waste as well. So,
Yep.
Yeah, it's tough all around.
Mhm.
That was really it. I was gonna ask about like food deserts.
Oh, that's a whole thing too.
Yeah. So I know that is going to be another kind of involved. And then, the maps that you had shown and, why they're bulking people. Is that really for political purposes? Is it like laziness? Is it
It's
just,
I mean, more than laziness, like by bulking, you mean the other category, like putting
Yeah.
Asian
Yeah.
American, Pacific Islander. Yeah, it's mostly just laziness. It's also the study just not being big enough. Part of what they'll say is that, well, we just didn't have enough respondents from these groups to be able to draw statistically significant conclusions.
Yeah.
In which case, like, ask more people.
Yeah.
like go, please go to North Dakota and ask some American Indigenous people. It's really not that hard. Or go anywhere in the Southwest. I don't know how much you could say is like an intentional political, act of aggression. I think it's malignant indifference.
Yeah.
I think it's not caring enough to understand why it might be important for those to be separate.
Yeah. Yeah. I was afraid you were going to say that, which just makes it even more of a, upsetting issue all around.
Oh, absolutely. And I could go on about this for so long.
Yeah. I mean, 1 in 8 is really a high statistic.
Yes. And I will be
Really
curious to
high.
see what happens to that number in the next couple of years, because things were really, really bad in 2020.
I was going to ask about COVID too, but
Oh, it
again,
was atrocious. Yeah, it was really, really bad. I actually got into this program at Georgetown for the fall of 2020, and COVID hit, and I delayed going to school. They let me delay it, thankfully. But I was sitting there going, I can't leave. This is the biggest American hunger crisis since the Great Depression. It actually might have been bigger than that. We didn't keep statistics back then, so we're not actually sure if it was worse in 2020 than it was in 1929 at the end of 1929. But it was just, the need was appalling. And our food pantries were calling us, telling us that they had 3 times the number of people coming to help, 4 times, 5 times. In El Paso, it was like 7 times for one really brief, awful month. Like, the need was so overwhelming because you had all of these people who were on the bubble,
right,
who maybe had been to a food pantry once or twice before in their life, maybe, but for the most part, like, with where they were at with their employment, they were paycheck to paycheck, but they could sustain themselves on that paycheck to paycheck. But then as soon as that paycheck fell out of existence, the bottom fell out of millions upon tens of millions of American households. And so I'll be interested to see what happens with that data, because it takes, like, we just got some of the 2020 data. like a couple weeks ago. It takes a while for it to be fully analyzed and everything. And I would imagine there'll be even more of a delay because all of the federal workers were furloughed or they were working from home. It was very difficult to conduct this kind of research. So I'll be curious to see what the data shows, but it was bad. I can tell you on the ground, it was really bad. And that's me on the ground, like sitting locked in my apartment with our team on Zoom, trying to do all of this, working with the pantries. I know it was just really, really difficult. And just the need was so crushing. It was already so crushing.
Yeah.
And it just got worse. And we're starting to see some recovery from that. The number of people coming for help every week has started to drop, at least anecdotally from the pantries that I've spoken to in the last probably 6 months. But COVID really took the bottom out of a lot of households who were paycheck to paycheck and would have been okay if that hadn't happened.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
Another
Lunches,
question.
for the summer lunches, do you know if it's easy for orgs to apply to the program? I would say easier than anything else from the federal government, but that's not a lot. I would suggest, Aaron, were you the one earlier who said that your church just started a pantry? That might be someone else, sorry. Not you, okay. I would check wherever you are, wherever your location is, check with, you can just search this on the USDA website, see who's already doing summer food service program, who's at least close to you, and then go ask them. Go ask them, because a lot of times summer food service programs can just add additional sites. So an organization, a sponsoring organization that's already done all the paperwork and the USDA knows who they are and they've reimbursed them and everyone's all good, they can just open another site as in another spot where kids can go get meals. That is a much easier process than as a new organization coming in, trying to apply for this. And there's a lot of regulation there, and there should be, but there's a lot of regulation about the nutritional value of the meals. There's very specific amounts of protein and calories and limits on salt and fat, and there's limits around like where you can serve it because it's the summer and it's hot, and you need to be able to prove you can keep it all in cold storage. So I would start by seeing who near you is close that's doing that, because it's much easier to add an additional site from an existing organization than it is to apply as your own. Happy to help.
does anyone else have any questions?
I just have one more before we go.
Mhm.
Hi. So I'm a new CPS investigator, and I seen that you mentioned like families can be scared to like speak up. I was just trying to see if you had any advice to like be able to help with aiding those families to be able to receive that food and not feel like ashamed or feel like they're neglecting their children.
Okay, I'm going to give you the best that I've got, and I'm not a caseworker, so you are going to be more of an expert on this than I am. What I will say is that asking for help for something like this is the least neglectful thing you can do as a parent. That is the least neglectful thing you can do.
Thank you. I definitely make sure I reiterate that to the families. I just thought I definitely should ask and stuff and see, if you had dealt with any situations like that.
Yeah, I would also, you can look some of this up too, but there's some really great resources out there on ways to ask these questions. Because the question of like, do you run out of money? Like, are you out of money? Like, why are your cupboards empty? That's a very different conversation than are you having a hard time at the end of the month?
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys having a lot of stress in your household because there just isn't enough money to cover all these expenses and food?
Yes.
There's
and that makes sense.
Yeah, there's ways to phrase this that are a lot less aggressive and a lot more, I think also if you can pitch it as, and again, not a caseworker here, but pitch it as, we know you're doing your best and that you're really stressed and overwhelmed. This is one thing that might help.
Yes. And I can see that being a lot more helpful for sure.
And just, here's something that can help. Here's a resource that exists to help people. Like I've done more with working with elderly folks that are just really, very ashamed and just really don't want to acknowledge that they're in this situation. One of the things that I found helps is saying things along the lines of, you paid for this already. You pay taxes.
Yes.
You have paid for this. This exists because you pay taxes.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. And we're going through as far as like tone and how to also, speak to individuals who may be in need so that they won't feel, bad about their current circumstances. So I'll definitely be taking that with me as well, because I haven't even thought about the food aspect until today, until you brought that up. You're just thinking about the kids' safety. You're not really thinking about them eating. So that's like a good topic to bring up.
Right. And it's always so frustrating because there's households where, if there was money, this would be fine.
Yes.
And there's a big difference between there isn't enough money to meet these kids' basic needs and neglect. But I don't think you'll ever go wrong with going in soft and gentle and acknowledging the power imbalance that's inherent there.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I'll definitely be implementing that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I hope it helps.
Yeah, Maria Rose, real quick.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, so a lot of us are at field internship sites where they're nonprofits or community organizations. So if they're interested in, like receiving food from Means, can they just go onto your website and apply? Okay.
Yep. So all they have to do is give us their address and their EIN number, which is their tax ID number. That allows us, we've got a bot that does this. Basically, it's just like, yep, you're a charity. Like the IRS agrees, you're a charity. And it allows us then they'll automatically get added. And then they tell us when they sign up, okay, I want text messages to tell me about this. I want emails, or I want both. And then I'm only interested in things between 50 pounds and 100 pounds, or I can't take anything more than 500 pounds. And then there's just a checklist of food. So this is a bread. It's a whole thing in the emergency food world to just be drowning in bread, just ungodly amounts of bread. It's our least checked box. But they can check boxes for let's say they've got a really great relationship with a farmer's market and they're like, we are good on fresh fruits and vegetables. You don't need to send me notifications about that. Great, cool. Then we won't. The system will only notify them about something that's available that fits the parameters they've told us about. And we won't bother them unless we have something they want. So they're not going to get text messages from us about fundraising or anything other than, hey, there's food, do you want it?
Awesome.
So the idea is that we exist in the background, that we're one more tool maybe for helping get a little bit more food. But other than that, we're not going to bother you. You don't need to change the way that you live your life as a charity. We'll just pop up and be like, hey, somebody has 500 pounds of mashed potatoes. Do you want it?
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, we definitely want to, spread the word about that since there's so many organizations.
Yeah, it's just meansdatabase.org. And the nonprofits can use it too if they get, we call it donation dumping. If somebody just shows up with the mac and cheese that happened to my home pantry, where this other church in our hometown was like, we're going to give you 10,000 boxes of mac and cheese to show how much we support you. And we were all just like, oh my God, why? There's less than 10,000 people in this town. What have you done?
Yeah.
So if you're a nonprofit on the receiving end of that, and you've got too much of whatever thing, you can also use it. Means will also allow you to post and notify all the other nonprofits nearby and say, hi, help. Do you want any mac and cheese? Here you go. So you can use it for that too. And you can get notifications from other nonprofits if they're in a similar situation.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you again for your presentation. This was really awesome. And
thank
so
you.
many
This
people...
has been the best part of my day.
Oh, you're glad.
I have been studying all day, so this is better.
Yay.
And thank you for the extra time as well.
Yeah, again,
For all of our
I
questions.
don't know if I've specified enough how much I don't want to